She's basically a free servant at this point. I froze. My husband, the man I'd cared for every single day for 5 years, called me that. A servant. My chest went cold. Every sleepless night, every meal, every wound I cleaned, and that's what I was to him. That was the moment something inside me broke. But to understand why that one sentence shattered me, you need to know everything that came before it. What would you do if the person you sacrificed everything for called you their servant? Would you stay quiet or make them regret it? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know. And before we get started, these stories take hours to write and edit. If you enjoy stories where karma finds its mark, please subscribe. It helps more than you think. Now, let me tell you how it all began. My name's Maya. I used to believe that love meant giving everything. Your time, your energy, your heart. And that somehow it would all come back to you. Ethan made me believe that. We met when I was 24, working as a nurse's aide. He was 30, an engineer who walked in one afternoon with a broken wrist. He was confident but kind, funny in that quiet, steady way that made you feel safe. He made everyone laugh, but somehow I felt like he only really saw me. A few months later, he asked me to dinner. A year after that, we were married. Ethan was my world. Charming. Ambitious. The kind of man who could walk into a room and make it brighter. We used to stay up late talking about our future. A little house, maybe a family one day. Everything felt possible. Until the night everything changed. He was driving home from work on a rainy evening. His car hydroplaned on the highway. When I got the call, I thought it was a mistake. But when I reached the hospital and saw him lying there, I knew our lives would never be the same. He survived, but the doctor said the words that tore through us both. Permanent paralysis. From the waist down, he cried. And I held his hand and said, "You're not alone. I'll never leave you." And I meant it. I quit my job to care for him full-time. Everyone said it was noble. But noble doesn't pay the bills. The insurance ran out. His company let him go. And I started taking whatever remote work I could find. Tutoring, bookkeeping, selling clothes online. Days blurred together. My back ached from lifting him, my hands cracked from cleaning. But I told myself love was worth it, that it was my duty. At first he was grateful. He'd smile when I brought him breakfast, thank me when I helped him into bed. But as time went on, the gratitude faded. "Did you forget my meds again? Why is dinner late? Stop hovering, Maya, you're smothering me." The warmth disappeared. The kindness turned to commands. I told myself it was the pain talking, that losing your independence changes you. And I kept going. But every day, I felt a little smaller, a little quieter, like I was disappearing inside the walls of our house. My friends stopped visiting. The house smelled like cleaning spray and reheated food. Sometimes, I'd catch my reflection in the window and not even recognize myself. Still, I stayed. Because I promised I would. And I thought that's what love meant. Keeping your promise, even when it hurts. But love built on sacrifice doesn't stay love forever. It becomes something else. Something colder. And I didn't know it then. But that promise I made out of love was about to become my prison. If I'd known what was coming, I might have walked away right then. 5 years. That's how long I stayed in that house, living the same day on repeat. Wake up. Help Ethan out of bed. Make breakfast. Clean. Work. Sleep. Repeat. I used to count the days by how often the grocery store ran discounts. That's how small my world had become. At first, I told myself it was temporary. That one day he'd recover, or at least, learn to smile again. But Ethan didn't want to get better. He wanted to be pitied. Every attempt I made to bring him joy to make life feel normal was met with resentment. If I laughed on the phone with a friend, he'd glare at me. If I went for a short walk, he'd text, "Where are you?" He didn't want a wife anymore. He wanted a warden. I became invisible except when he needed something. "Maya, fix the cushion." "Maya, I spilled my drink." "Maya, come here." That name, my name, stopped sounding like mine. I tried to remind myself that I chose this. That I promised to stand by him. But deep down, something started to rot inside me. It wasn't anger yet, just exhaustion. The kind that makes your bones feel heavy. Then came Lana, Ethan's younger sister. 28, flawless, and always dressed like she was heading to a party. The kind of person who walks into a room and makes you feel shabby just for existing. She started visiting more often after year 3. At first, I was grateful. I thought, maybe he'll talk to her, maybe she'll lift his mood. But her visits weren't for him. They were to remind me where I stood. "Wow, you're still doing everything for him?" she'd say, crossing her legs on the couch, eyes on her phone. "I don't know how you do it, Maya. I'd lose my mind." She'd laugh, and Ethan would smirk. Not once did he defend me. One afternoon, while I was cleaning the living room, Lana leaned toward him and said, "You know, if you'd married someone more ambitious, maybe she'd have hired help by now." Ethan chuckled. "She's good at this stuff. It gives her purpose." I stopped vacuuming. The words hung in the air like smoke. He didn't even notice me standing there. That night, I cried quietly in the bathroom so he wouldn't hear. The tears burned my face, not from sadness but from shame. Somewhere along the line, I'd stopped being his wife. I'd become his caretaker, his nurse, his servant. And worst of all, I'd started to believe that's all I was worth. I worked myself into silence. While he watched TV or played online games, I'd scrub the floors, organize bills, track medications. There was always something to do, and never anyone to do it but me. The house was spotless. But inside, I was falling apart. The isolation ate at me. Friends stopped calling. Family grew distant. Even my voice started to sound strange to me, like it belonged to someone else. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see Maya anymore. Just tired eyes and an apron that never seemed to come off. The days turned into months, the months into years. And slowly, the resentment I buried began to wake up. I noticed how Ethan smiled when Lana visited. How his tone softened when he talked to her but sharpened with me. How they whispered after dinner, sharing glances I couldn't quite read. Sometimes, she'd leave her perfume behind, a sharp, sweet scent that clung to the air long after she was gone. It made my stomach turn. Still, I said nothing. I convinced myself I was overthinking, that my exhaustion was twisting things in my head. But part of me knew something was changing. I could feel it, like standing in the still air before a storm. The dynamic in that house had shifted, and I was the only one who hadn't realized I was already on the outside. Ethan's tone grew colder. He stopped thanking me altogether. He'd talk about me like I wasn't in the room. "She's fine," he'd tell his friends online. "She likes taking care of things. Things. Not people. Not me." Every word chipped away at the person I used to be. And the more they took from me, the quieter I became. But there's only so much quiet a person can live in before they break. The day it finally happened started like every other day. Coffee, breakfast, cleaning. But by the time that sun set, my silence would end. It was a Saturday in August. The kind of day that feels heavy even before it begins. The air was humid, the blinds half closed, and the house smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning spray. Lana was over again. She'd been visiting almost every weekend lately, always claiming she wanted to help, though I'd never once seen her lift a finger. Ethan was in his wheelchair in the living room, TV humming in the background, while I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for lunch. From where I stood, I could hear their voices. Soft at first, then clearer. Lana laughed. "You really hit the jackpot, huh? A live-in maid who doesn't even get paid." Ethan chuckled his laugh, the same one that used to make me feel safe. "Yeah," he said, "she's basically a free servant at this point." I froze. The knife slipped from my hand and clattered against the counter. The sound was small, but in that moment, it felt deafening. My heart started pounding. I waited, hoping, praying I'd misheard. But then he kept going. "She actually thinks she's being noble. I just let her believe it. It makes things easier." Lana giggled. "You're terrible." "I'm practical," he said, his tone calm, almost proud. "And hey, free servant, free meals, free company, works out." My stomach twisted. Every word dug into me like glass. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. 5 years of my life. 5 years of changing his catheter, feeding him, bathing him. 5 years of sleepless nights and empty apologies. And this was how he saw me. Not as a wife. Not as a partner. A servant. Something inside me went still. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something colder. Sharper. I stood there, staring at the half-cut vegetables on the board, listening to their laughter drift down the hallway. I wanted to storm in there, to scream, to throw every plate in the house. But I didn't. I just wiped my hands. Slowly, quietly. Then I walked to my room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were trembling. My chest hurt like I'd been punched. And for a long time, I didn't move. When you spend years caring for someone, your anger doesn't explode. It crystallizes. It becomes something deliberate, careful, patient. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of his breathing from down the hall. Every inhale and exhale felt like a countdown. I thought about all the things I'd given up: my job, my friends, my family, my freedom. And I realized something that scared me more than anything else. I wasn't caring for him out of love anymore. I was caring for him out of habit, because I didn't know who I was without him. And maybe that's what he counted on. Maybe that's why he felt so sure I'd never leave. But he was wrong. Over the next few days, I started seeing things differently. The way he'd hide his phone when I walked in. The late-night laughter coming from the living room when he thought I was asleep. The mysterious packages arriving at the door: women's products, clothes, things that definitely weren't for me. I started connecting the dots. It wasn't just that he saw me as a servant. He and Lana had been using me. For money. For care. For control. And the worst part? They thought I was too meek, too loyal, too broken to notice. They didn't know me anymore. Because while Ethan might have lost the use of his legs, I hadn't lost my mind. And I still had access to everything. Our bank accounts, our medical records, our shared passwords. All the power he thought was his? He'd handed it to me years ago. So I smiled. I made his meals. I washed his clothes. I pretended nothing had changed. But inside, I was planning. Carefully. Quietly. Completely. Because I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to cry. I was going to make them regret every single word they said that day. They thought I was their servant. They were about to learn who really served who. That was the moment I decided they'd regret ever crossing me. After that day, everything looked the same. But I wasn't the same. I woke up at the same time. Made breakfast. Did his laundry. Smiled when I had to. But inside, I was studying him. Every movement. Every glance. Every lie that used to pass unnoticed. It's strange how, when you stop loving someone, you start seeing them clearly. I noticed the way his eyes lit up when his phone buzzed. How he'd lower his voice when he talked to friends online. How the corners of his mouth twitched when he tried not to smile. He was hiding something, and I was done pretending not to see it. I started small. Checking the bank statements. I noticed payments I didn't recognize. Amazon orders, gift cards, random online transfers. All under his name. All using our joint account. Then came the credit card bill. New charges for perfume, makeup, jewelry. None of it was mine. I didn't even wear perfume anymore. The last bottle I owned had dust on it. Every detail, every receipt, felt like proof that the life I thought we shared was a lie. One night, when he'd fallen asleep, I opened his laptop. He never changed the password. I'd set it for him years ago. I told myself I was only looking for confirmation, but what I found made my hands go numb. Private messages. Hundreds of them. Between him and Lana. At first, they looked harmless. Family chatter, jokes. But then, the tone changed. Late-night messages. Photos. Flirting that crossed every boundary. She called him my favorite man. He called her sweetheart. And buried in those messages was something worse. Talk about how easy I made things for them. How I handled all the chores, all the bills. How they were set for life because I was too devoted to ever leave. Reading it didn't even hurt anymore. It felt surgical, clean, precise. Like removing a tumor you've lived with so long you'd forgotten how sick it made you. I sat there in the dark, the glow of the screen on my face, and I finally understood what I had become to them. Not a wife. Not family. Just a resource. A means to an end. And the worst part? They thought I'd never do anything about it. That realization didn't break me. It focused me. For the first time in 5 years, I wasn't surviving anymore. I was planning. The next morning, I acted like nothing had changed. I made his breakfast, smiling as I placed the tray beside him. He thanked me absent-mindedly, eyes on his phone. He didn't notice the difference in my tone. Didn't notice that I was no longer his wife, just his shadow watching, listening, memorizing. Over the next few weeks, I started collecting everything I'd need. Photos, screenshots, bank records. Every transfer, every purchase, every message that tied them together. I called a lawyer quietly. Explained the situation, the accounts, the shared assets. She told me to gather evidence, to stay calm, to act normal. So I did. Every smile, every conversation, every small kindness. All of it was a mask. At night, I'd sit by the window while they whispered in the living room. Their laughter used to make my blood boil. Now it just fueled me. Every sound was proof that my revenge was necessary. Sometimes I'd catch Lana looking at me, her lips curling into that smug little smirk, as if she knew I'd never stand up to her. She had no idea I'd already started dismantling everything they depended on. It began with the finances. I moved the joint savings into a private account under my name, changed the passwords. Slowly, so they wouldn't notice. Then, I canceled the automatic payments tied to his expenses except the essentials. Bills would start to pile up soon, but by the time he realized, it would be too late. Meanwhile, I arranged appointments, doctors, therapists, aides, and made sure his care information was updated to list only me as primary contact. It was subtle, but it gave me control over everything. And while I was doing all that, I smiled. I laughed when they laughed. I made small talk. I cooked Lana's favorite meals when she stayed over. I played the perfect wife, the perfect fool. Because the only thing better than revenge is watching the people who underestimate you hand you the tools to destroy them. By the end of that month, I had everything I needed. Financial control, legal evidence, and a plan that would cut them both off completely. They just didn't know yet. And I wasn't going to warn them. I wanted them to feel safe. I wanted them to think they'd won. Because that's when the fall hurts most. Right after the moment you believe you're untouchable. I kept smiling because I'd learned that smiles can be the most convincing lies. Every morning I pushed his wheelchair to the window, arranged the cushions just so, and made his coffee the way he liked it, 2 weak, with 2 sugars. Lana would arrive, perfume in the air, telling me I should relax more, as if relaxing were a hobby I could pick up between catheter changes and billing cycles. I laughed with them. I chopped vegetables and set the table. I asked about Lana's job and listened when she talked about travel plans I would never take. But while they talked, I was working. Quietly, methodically. First, I tightened control where it mattered most. I moved our joint savings into a separate account under my name, slow transfers over weeks, nothing big enough to set off alarms. I changed passwords to accounts Ethan never used and updated recovery emails to addresses only I could access. I didn't touch anything flashy. I left small, believable transactions alone, so the activity looked normal. Next came the paperwork. I made copies of medical records, insurance claims, and receipts. I printed message threads and backed them up to a hidden drive. I did everything the lawyer had told me. Document, timestamp, preserve. Evidence is the scaffolding of a good plan, dry, boring, and impossible to argue with in court. I called a friend who owed me one and asked for a favor, a temporary P.O. box under a different name. I booked a consultation with a local private investigator, not to spy but to get an expert's advice on documenting digital footprints. I learned the language they use so my evidence couldn't be dismissed as hearsay. Each call, each appointment, felt like another nail in the box I was building around them. Then I shifted toward the stagecraft. They needed to feel secure, complacent, untouchable, so I gave them reasons to be. I booked a short girls' night for Lana at a restaurant 2 blocks away. I convinced Ethan that it was a harmless evening out for him to play online without interruptions. I volunteered to handle a few of his bills, transferring small sums here and there, paying an odd invoice, all with a smile. Nothing they could point to as unusual. At home, I began to edge things into place. I scheduled a routine follow-up with his specialist and updated the contact details to list me, Maya, as the primary contact. I added a home care checklist to the file with dates and times. I arranged for a visiting nurse to come for assessments, and on the forms, I carefully noted observations that reflected Ethan's dependency and his lack of outside support. That documentation later became critical. It painted the picture of who had been really doing the work. I also tightened the screws on the money side. I set automatic alerts for any transactions over a small amount to go to my phone. Small charges flagged, I could trace Pattern's perfume, delivery addresses that matched Lana's social profiles, gift cards bought late at night. I started sending polite, professional-sounding emails to vendors when charges looked odd, asking them to confirm shipping details. The replies came back like breadcrumbs. All the while, I cultivated the performance of the forgiving wife. I let Lana cook lunch sometimes, watched Ethan's face soften, and I laughed at jokes I used to find hollow. I stroked his hair when he flinched and pretended I didn't notice the smiles exchanged between them in private. I made a point to be visible, to be the calm center of the household, because that's what made them careless. I even staged small, generous gestures that would later sting. I offered to transfer a little money to Lana for an emergency. She claimed to have convenient, public, and traceable. I took him to coffee with his gaming buddies and sat quietly while they praised him in ways that used to feel like praise, but now felt like nails being hammered into a coffin. On the outside, everything looked ordinary. Inside, it was a quiet war of attrition. My days were now split between caregiving and engineering their collapse. I rehearsed what I would say if anyone asked, calm, factual, impossibly reasonable. It's important in a takedown to sound sane. Weeks turned into months. Each small move stitched the net tighter. The joint account dwindled in a way they'd paved themselves for. Monthly automatic payments I'd removed started to fail quietly. Vendors sent notices that landed on our doormat unread. Interest penalties accumulated. They assumed it was a system error, a bank glitch. They didn't imagine I'd done any of it. I made one critical choice. I would not act alone in public. Revenge that looks personal is often dismissed as emotion. I wanted legal and social consequence. So I coordinated with the lawyer to have everything ready: copies of messages, transaction histories, medical records, and the visiting nurse's reports. We timed court consultations and drafted letters that would be sent at precise moments. It was clinical work, antiseptic, and exact. There were risks. Had I been discovered, I'd have lost everything: my home, my reputation, the one good thing I'd built for myself in years. But standing in the kitchen the night he called me a servant, I decided fear was a worse fate than ruin. The final piece was the reveal. I considered different forms: an explosive confrontation, a social media expose, a legal filing, but I wanted something that cut deeper than humiliation. I wanted to remove their safety net, financial control, social standing, and the comfortable lie they told themselves. I wanted it to be irreversible. I arranged for the right people to be present: lawyers, a caseworker, and, quietly, a journalist who'd covered similar stories. I prepared statements and facts that wouldn't smell like vindictiveness, but like evidence. I wrote a calm, measured letter to family members, outlining exactly what had happened, attaching the proof. I scheduled the timing so their explanations would be meaningless. Everything would already be documented, stamped, and undeniable. Then, in the days before the execution, I did what I had always done best. I played the part. I cooked his favorite meals. I placed fresh flowers on the table. I ran my fingers through his hair and told him small, unremarkable things about my day. They believed me. They relaxed. They smiled. They started to plan like everything would go on forever. That comfort would be their undoing. I told no one I trusted with the secret plan, because secrets are safer when they live only inside your head. I moved through the house like a silent author, rearranging the paragraphs of their lives so the ending I wanted would read exactly as I'd written it. And then the morning came when all the small, patient things I'd done would snap together. The trap was set. The paperwork was in order. The accounts were ready to be frozen. The letters were queued. Their safety, their sense of superiority, would collapse not with a scream but with a sealed envelope and a quiet, official voice. They thought I was still their servant. They had no idea how long I'd been learning their weaknesses or how precise I could be. When you've cared for someone, you learn everything about them. You know their habits, their soft spots, their ways to be manipulated. I'd used that knowledge like a map. And now I was standing at the edge of the last step. There was no going back. The morning it began felt ordinary. I woke, made coffee, and set a plate of toast beside him like I had every day for years. He grunted his thanks without looking up. Lana was due that afternoon for lunch. They both thought the day would unfold exactly as usual. I called the lawyer and the caseworker before anyone else was awake. Calm, factual, everything on the record. Then I sat at the table and took a breath the way I always had before starting a hard task. Only this task was for me. First, the bank. I walked into our local branch with my ID and the paperwork the lawyer had prepared. The clerk was polite, the forms clinical. I asked to freeze the joint account and transfer immediate control to me, pending an inquiry into suspicious transactions. I used the words they expect: fraud, unauthorized transfers, financial exploitation. Her face was sympathetic. She moved with the automated efficiency of someone who processes hurt people every day. Back home, I set the table for lunch as if nothing were wrong. I timed everything to the minute. The nurse's assessment was scheduled to arrive around 1. The lawyer would send a certified letter to their address the moment the bank action completed. The caseworker would begin contacting vendors and service providers about the irregular payments. The plan was not a spectacle. It was administrative, airtight, and humiliating in the slowest, most irreversible way. They arrived, laughing. Lana kissed his cheek and raised her voice playfully. "How's our king today?" Ethan basked in it, the way men do when they're certain they've won. I poured wine. I smiled and served the salad I'd prepared myself. I sat and listened as they talked, arms brushing across the table, taking little private looks at each other. Their comfort made my hands steady. The nurse called in to say she'd be stopping by for a standard well-being check, and I texted the lawyer, now. I watched Ethan's face as his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then back to me, suspicion flickering for the first time in months. It passed. The first domino fell quietly. A vendor's automated message arrived. A payment had failed. An invoice notice slipped through their casual conversation like a cold draft. Lana frowned, then laughed it off. "It's probably a bank glitch." Ethan shrugged and went back to his game. The certified letter arrived next, left in his mailbox, stamped and official. It was neutral in tone but devastating in content. Documentation of unauthorized charges, copies of messages linking him and Lana, evidence of exploitation. The letter explained the account freeze and the process to resolve it. It told him plainly that the bank had been notified of a possible financial exploitation investigation. He read it and his face went white. He looked at Lana, she looked at him. For the first time that afternoon, they were not on the same side. Calls started vendors, the caseworker, the lawyer. Men with clipped professional voices said things like, "We need to speak with the primary account holder," and "We're opening an inquiry." The tone of the room shifted from cozy to clinical. They tried to joke, but their smiles faltered. They tried to blame a system error. The bank records were clear, the messages were clear, the nurse's report and the logged home visits were clear. It didn't matter they'd thought themselves clever. Paperwork, once assembled, becomes truth in a way anger never does. People with rubber stamps and official headers speak a language that courts and employers and relatives understand. I had spent weeks translating their casual cruelty into that language. Word spread slowly at first. A call to Ethan's old employer, someone who still owed favors, confirmed that he'd been drawing PIP and other benefits with no clear oversight. The caseworker explained to me, gently, the resources available: protective orders, reassignment of assets, restraining access to accounts when exploitation is alleged. It was all sterile and proper, and finally the right sort of weapon. Lana tried to leave, brushing past me. I let her. She could feel the change but still didn't connect it to me. She called someone outside, words sharp with panic. Ethan tried to stand, pushed his wheelchair against the table, but the look in his eyes was small and frantic. It was the first time I'd seen fear on his face. When the lawyer arrived, calm and precise, she positioned herself between us like a referee. She spoke in measured sentences. She read the messages I'd printed, showed the transaction history, and explained the legal consequences. She told them what would happen if they didn't cooperate. There was no shouting, no melodrama. Just facts. Their defenses crumbled under the weight of documentation. They tried to claw back excuses, stress, poor judgment, emotional confusion. They offered money, apologies, promises. I had heard every form of apology before. None of them meant anything. What mattered were the copies of messages, the timestamps, the bank statements. Evidence doesn't plead, it shows. When relatives were called, some didn't answer. Some came quietly and took in the facts, their faces folding into something like disbelief that turned fast into anger. A family meeting followed. Someone said they'd always suspected Lana wasn't trustworthy. Another relative mentioned change of address delays and odd purchases. The small web they had spun unraveled thread by thread. I watched all of it as if from a distance. I had rehearsed this part more than anything else, the looks, the words, the calm. I didn't gloat, I didn't dance. I sat in the chair I'd been using for years and let the machine of consequence do its work. The final stroke was procedural: guardianship reviews, asset freezes, and the formal reassignment of account control. The bank placed temporary holds, the utilities were put on alert, and the landlord was informed of potential abuse of services. Their comfort evaporated. The social scaffolding that had supported their risky behavior, the assumed silence, the belief I would never act, collapsed. They were humiliated. Not in the sensational way movies show, no screaming, no dramatic exits, but in the way that matters. Stripped of power, forced into explanations, watched and judged by documents and by people who could remove privileges. There's a particular silence that comes with being exposed, a bland, heavy kind of quiet. It filled the house like dust after a storm. When I finally spoke, it was soft, not triumphant, just steady. "You called me a servant," I said. "You used me. You took from me for years." Their faces were pale. Lana's mouth opened into a wordless gasp. Ethan's shoulders curled like a man trying to protect something fragile. Their shame was a living, moving thing. "I kept the records," I told them. "I filed the reports. I've given copies to our lawyer and the caseworker. The bank has frozen access. You need to answer for what you've done." They had no answer that mattered. Not to me. Not to the law. Not to the people who'd been called in. I did not enjoy the moment so much as I respected its necessity. Revenge had been replaced by accountability. That was the point. I wanted them to feel the consequences of thinking they could take everything and call it normal. When it was over, when the calls tapered and the last relative left, the house settled into a different quiet. It was no longer the hollow hush of a place where I had been erased. It was a quiet emptied of pretense and cruelty. They were no longer untouchable, and neither was I. The first few days felt oddly ordinary and unnervingly permanent. The bank held to their freeze for the investigation. Vendors called to ask who would settle invoices. The visiting nurse updated her reports. I answered each call with the same steadiness I'd cultivated for months. Neighbors glanced with curiosity, some avoided our porch. I felt the weight of their eyes and the odd kindness of strangers, people who offered a casserole or a kind word in the grocery store. It was small comfort, but it was real. Ethan retreated into himself, the way wounded animals do. He stopped attempting jokes that landed flat. He no longer asked me to fix small things or chastised me for trivial delays. Lana packed a bag and left the house in a hurry that suggested she had more to lose than just a place to sleep. I didn't watch her go. I didn't speak. There were practical matters, legal meetings, appointments with therapists for both of us. I sat across from professionals and told the truth with the same factual clarity I'd used to build my case. They called it financial exploitation and emotional manipulation. I called it what it was: betrayal. Friends reached out cautiously. Some wanted to avoid the drama, others wanted to stand with me. There were apologies from people who'd once smiled in my company but hadn't known what to say. There was time spent on the phone with family members who were suddenly present in a way they hadn't been for years. It was strange, awkward, and restorative at once. Therapy helped. Saying aloud what I'd lived through gave shape to the fog in my head. The therapist taught me the word I'd been avoiding: grief. I'd grieved for the life I thought I had and for the person I'd become in service of someone else. A slow reconstruction began: little things at first. A cup of coffee on the porch without a schedule glued to it. A short walk to the park, reconnecting with friends who didn't measure me by how much I could give them. I started looking at work again, remote bookkeeping, and a few stable clients. It felt tentative, like dipping a toe in cold water. But the money was mine, earned without apology. The house was still mine on paper, and for the first time in years, I was making decisions because I wanted to, not because someone else expected me to. There were still hard moments. I'd catch myself listening for footsteps I knew would never come. I'd wake some nights with the echo of his voice, the word servant, lodged in my throat like a stone. The shame they tried to hand me didn't disappear overnight. Healing rarely does. And then, sometimes, small things shifted. A friend brought over a plant. I bought new curtains and chose them for the first time in years because I wanted bright colors. I started a tiny journal and wrote, in small, careful letters, lists of things I liked: coffee black, jazz in the mornings, the smell of rain on hot pavement. It felt almost childish to reclaim preferences, but it was mine. People asked if I felt guilty. Guilty for taking their bank accounts? For calling the authorities? For exposing family secrets? The answer wasn't simple. There was a tug in my chest for the life that used to be before the betrayal, but also the clear knowledge that I had been used. I had allowed it in part because I'd been kind, and in part because I'd been afraid. The lack of guilt came from a recognition that protecting myself was not a crime. Months later, when the dust had settled enough to breathe through, I stood at the kitchen window and watched sunlight spill across the counter. The house was quieter in a different way, emptier of people who took for granted, and fuller of things I'd chosen to keep. I didn't want to be defined by what happened to me. I wanted the story to be a turning point, not a permanent obituary for the woman I'd once been. So I wrote down plans, small goals, that grew bolder with time. A savings account in my name, a course to update my bookkeeping skills, friends to meet for brunch, plans that were not about anyone else. Revenge had given me retribution. The aftermath gave me something harder: responsibility for myself. It was not a clean, triumphant victory. It was a long, sometimes lonely path back. But it was mine. If you made it this far, thank you. This wasn't a story about perfect endings or cinematic payback. It was about recognizing worth, stopping exploitation, and reclaiming a life. Sometimes justice isn't dramatic. It's paperwork, witnesses, and the courage to say, enough. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing. These true stories take hours to gather and hours more to tell. Your support keeps this channel alive, and it helps bring more people's voices into the light. And one last thing, if you've ever been taken for granted or found yourself giving until you had nothing left, I'd like to know. What did you do? Share in the comments. I read every one. Take care of yourself. You're worth more than the word servant.